Bare whisper of the, I'll call it concept of Paul Virilio of the so-called imposture of immediacy has reached me. Um, some echoes on the theme. So I think of Mathew 18:20, where there are two or three gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of you. So my inclination is not at all to depreciate this passage, but only it's just that so I don't attempt to give a Christian interpretation or a Christological Christ-centered interpretation of the matter, but only I think of concrete experience of how this you had to be there type of experience happens. So I distinguish you had to be there from the doctrine of subjectivity, which is superimposed over most people who have had their dose of 10, 12, 15, 20 years of education in the West. You had to be there means, so for instance, if two or three people are talking about a subject, one mentions something, another responds to it, a third chimes in after hearing the second respond, and there's some kind of mood, some kind of atmosphere is obtained, but it's of such a character that it can't be logically analyzed because it's a you had to be there thing. Often these things can be communicated in some way because they've become, there's shorthand for them in the vernacular, but in the full extent it would be something that, so I guess the vernacular allows for that exactly with this Sprachspiel, you had to be there. So in the context, so thinking of that and thinking of the high statement of that in the Mathew 18:20, and thinking of the holy necessity of phenomenological thought, which is direct and out of our own experience, we can link that up then to that which is far beyond what any one person can properly give an account of, which is this imposture of immediacy. So far as I take that, it seemed to suggest the global media situation and the rapidity of communication in the sense of, so one statement of it that was given was of the Chinese whispering, or we call it in America the telephone game, but not in a circle of people sitting on say chairs, as it's stated, in a circle, whispering into one of the other's ears, where the message is distorted as it goes along in the crackle of the electricity of fiber optic lines, or more of what's in question here, and say multiple news stations, including strictly forbidden RT, or the better would be, according to Alexander Dugin, Zargrad television. He thinks this is the better outlet, better than RT. He doesn't say this, but I would say it is that I think RT is somewhat designed to catch the ear of the sophisticated Americans. It speaks to an academic audience, and I used to see quite frequently on Twitter RT retweets do not indicate that we advocate the content or something to that extent. So the full concept seems so I don't know. I'm not a student of Virilio, but I think of it in the context of, so we have Judith Shklar, Liberalism of Fear. We have, so think of it, just the fear of people in everyday life to tread water because they're the equivalent of the French villain, or the which is basically a peasant, peasant. But the good of using that word is, of course, because villain becomes villain. So that as if peasant would become something like bad hombre or whatever Trump says. We have also Zygmunt Bauman or Boyman with his liquid fear, which I find a very congenial conception. And then we have so this, which I've just recently heard of, is the Imposture of Immediacy, which I'm told is after making a comment on it, I'm told it's Chinese whisper game with added on fear. So actually it's I remember that a friend of mine once told me that he went to see some Hollywood movie. This is an unusual outsider type of person from Las Vegas, who drives around in his truck and lives in his truck. And he said he went to see into the theater, this is years ago, to see some film, and the first thing that happened when he was like in the theater is there popped on the screen the words fear, like filling the whole cinema, and he was genuinely afraid. So it's like it was kind of like, you know, those first videos of the train coming through the film screen, and people didn't quite know it was actually gonna be the end of them or whatever, come into the theater. But Buster Keaton sitting on the front of the train. But this general conception of fear, I think, is one thing that's very repressed in the most media accounts of this situation. And so that's very interesting. And I think if this imposture of immediacy means sort of like there's an event like the current Israel stuff, then it appears on all these media outlets. It appeared everybody knows about it. And I think actually the example that's given in the presentation, which is on that, I think he calls it Owen and Agon, his YouTube channel is 9/11, so that people know sort of where they were during 9/11, and also that this 9/11 led to a chain of various events, just as somehow like the Ukraine situation is leading to chains of various events on a global scale, and perhaps in a certain way to I call it a kind of a soft World War III, because the blocks are gaining up, and there's increasingly articles coming out of like Atlantic Council think tank and other such CIA sources, or people that give like recommendations to the CIA, basically academics or former CIA guys like Mathew saying that there's like, they don't use the I forget the new phrase. It's not, you know, they used to use the phrase axis of evil or something like that, which vaguely reminds of the Axis powers, but they're talking about like the authoritarian groups, which are creating a block. So of course there's the BRICS and the new members to the BRICS, which includes, strangely enough, Egypt, which is like very yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, not just Egypt, but so Egypt is basically owned by Saudi Arabia. In case people haven't looked into this, but since this watershed year of 2014, which Putin is now saying was the beginning of this current conflict in Ukraine, or the CIA put a lot of heavy backing into the Maidan Square stuff. I'm still waiting, by the way, for hoping that the guy with the podcast in France, expatriate Russian, very thorough and serious historian, Vladimir Brovkin, will give us more thorough account of the 2014 Maidan Square and what happened there. But at the same time, what was happening is that in Egypt, the Islamic Brotherhood had been voted legally into power, and because there's a kind of schism, a deep schism between sort of like in Lawrence Arabia, they talk about like dirty Bedouins, which is how, or Joe Pesci in Casino talks about sand niggers. If you excuse the outlawed phrase, and the old Turkish caliphate, the people of Turkey, who kind of think this is not our Islam. These are disgusting people, and there's, if you don't believe it, then just look at the history of the struggle over Mecca itself, over the concession of Mecca, over building a multi-billion-dollar hotel in Mecca, like Las Vegas and so on, which was a struggle between Saudi Arabian interest and the former Ottoman interest, which collapsed, of course, at the end of World War II. But anyway, so the people the former Ottomans were more close to would be this Muslim Brotherhood that was just taking over Egypt. And so exactly like in a Spectre thing, into a James Bond plot, General Sisi of Egypt took a payoff of $20 billion, and with the promise for more payoffs in future years from Saudi Arabia, and he pulled a military coup and got rid of the elected government, and he's been in power since. So that was the Saudis taking over, which I must admit, this John Wick, I don't like the series anymore that much. The last one he kept it falling like from 10 stories up and then just standing up or whatever. Is too silly. But the earlier ones were maybe a little better. But it has that feature. I think it's probably based on a graphic novel of this sort of Saudis being on the so-called high table, which is kind of like a organized crime, a reference for, like, I don't know, Latino, Mexican mafia, or some other form of organized crime that's structured like a military. They talk about the table above it. Is it? I forget how that's called in Spanish, Merte or something. But so yeah, in 2014, those two events happened, and Egypt, therefore, is sort of like controlled by Saudi Arabia now, and since 2014. But it's interesting that Saudi Arabia snubbed Blinken. So does this signal, and they're going over to the BRICS, does that signal that they're on the so-called, what these articles are now calling, kind of CIA articles are now calling, like they don't use this phrase exactly, axis of authoritarians. They have some new phrase, like I have to look that up again, I'm sorry. But something, they're talking about authoritarian governments rather than themselves, so-called democratic governments, and they're begging, saying, oh, we need more money for the military and so on. That's the usual stuff, of course. But our current level of lethality isn't optimized and so on. It's like the question of how many generations of Apple phones. I ask this in all seriousness. It's actually, I think it's not a joke question. It's like, how many years can cell phones have a new version every year? Can it go on for 300 years? Going to go on for 20,000 years? It's a very strange question. I don't understand how that's going to work. But the whole model of these businesses is, in fact, it's based on a Keynesian scheme of the short run is for suckers, and in the long run you can use the mystical carrot to say our stock will always be, drawing dividends, because in at least your lifetime will always be making a new model of iPhone or whatever it is every year. The promise of the future profits being way more important, and the Goethean infinity and so on and so forth being way more important than the short run, and then the sort of always backward, always a little bit pathetic claims of persons who are against going off the gold standard and making a big fuss about inflation and Keynesianism and so on. That's a rump type of complaint that only serves the purpose of sort of burning down Watts or something in order to signal divine rage of Walter Benjamin or something. But so I think if this imposture of immediacy is means to also include all these global media sudden bursts up, it's interesting to superimpose those other ideas of the Mathew 18:20, of the whenever you're two or three are gathered, but instead whenever like all these media channels are gathered saying different things, and people hear that, and then there's responding, and it creates an object, which is you had to be their object historical object, an actual Dasein, a concrete Dasein, which everybody is globally due to the increase in global immediacy, which doesn't, Heidegger reminds us, mean that the closeness happens, closeness of eyes meeting eyes and floating into the presence of the other, but instead it's the rapidity of the cybernetic and the technological essence. So Aristotle, I just as a coda, Aristotle says the spider has a techne because it spins a web. So techne is this thing that doesn't think, according to the Aristotelian analysis of an insect. He doesn't say there's a lot of layers to what Aristotle says of the move from insects to clever beasts to etc., but they don't think in the full sense is the point. Some people won't accept that, but Heidegger is bent on pushing that view. I think that's the difference between a full Buddhist teaching, where there's no exceptionalist, and this thing with being is, at least in some small way, given an example in that one still would say there's something more enviable about being a human being than being a spider, and that a spider doesn't really think with its web, or if it does, it's in some extremely slow motion way, and only thinking in, if you put it into this some kind of cosmic perspective between the spider and the evolution to the Moses talking to the fiery cloud, or to the, as Maimonides puts it, this is to the philosophically minded, to the confused or the perplexed. He says this amounts to the so-called Aristotelian active intelligence, which would be the intelligence of the God that never goes out of being, that never has to have an ex nihilo entree, as does the Christian God. Okay, so that's the end of the labor of Hercules, or reflection.